See my screen okay?
Looks good.
Great. Okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in to the session. Really excited to be here today. I've worked with a lot of Citizens Climate Lobby members in my role over the last couple of years. So I'm excited to be a part of this conference for the first time. I'll start off by introducing myself. My name is Noah Dalzell, and I'm the director of the State Climate Policy Network at ClimateXChange. And I'm here with my colleague Jonah. Jonah, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Hi guys. My name is Jonah. I am the research director at ClimateXChange, and I'll be hopping back and forth with Noah today on the state updates.
Awesome. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the State Climate Policy Network, which I'm sure many of you have kind of worked with or interacted with in the past. But we are a network of about 13,000 policymakers, advocates, business leaders, university professors, experts who are pushing for effective and equitable climate policies in their states. So we represent members across all 50 states. Every month we host a national update call on updates related to climate policy developments across these different states. I'm sure some of you have participated in those calls, and actually that's where I'll be drawing a lot of my updates from today. So certainly if anything that I share is not the most up to date, feel free to chime in the chat box and share additional resources and your thoughts. I know many of you are the ones that are really pushing for change and for policies across these different states. We also host monthly webinars, and so that's an opportunity to just learn from experts in the field about different issues related to climate policy. And really our core function is sharing information, sharing research, analysis, and promoting cross-collaboration across state lines. So very much in line with an event like today where we can gather with advocates across different states and make sure that we're all on the same page about what's going on in different places, connect with one another. And definitely, Jonah, if you want to drop a link to the SCPN page so people can explore kind of the different state updates there, that might be helpful. And yeah, really excited to be here. And I'll pass it over to you, Jonah, for a couple of slides.
Sure thing. And I just dropped the network link in the chat. I'll be dropping a bunch of links in, including with the stuff I'm about to talk about. And I think it's important really quickly just expand a little bit on who I am and what my role is at ClimateXChange. My job is to provide technical assistance to the states, and that's through the membership predominantly, but also through the states that we have direct locations in Maryland and Massachusetts and bill writing. And a lot of that work revolves, around technicals of policy, but really quickly becomes about political strategy first and foremost, because oftentimes within the state, the basics of a good policy are already there and well understood by the environmental movement. But what's missing a lot of the time is knowledge sharing across state lines on what works and what doesn't work when it comes to political approaches at the state level. And that is really the driving force behind the network. And I assume one of the driving forces behind this everyone on this call today. So I want to start with a little bit of narrative before we get into the kind of the cut and dry policy updates, because I think without narrative and without action, those policy updates don't really pop. We want to understand what the story of what happened over the past year is from the perspective at least of one individual whose job was to get involved and survey all 50 states on this at the same time. So we're approaching the anniversary of COVID lockdown. And there are 4 major transformations in the movement that have happened since then. And I apologize, there's 5. I got a little carried away after deciding there was 4, so I'm going to couple the last 2 together. But there's these major transformations are not to be underestimated. This is one of the biggest changes in the movement, of the environmental movement, that may have ever happened and may continue to ever happen for a long time. So the first one of those is public health. This is obviously a concern with COVID, but the science in priority to air pollution and its relationship to our climate policy and politics has also gone through a major transformation. And I'm going to illustrate this with a few numbers and studies. First, right off the bat, as of today, up to around 500,000 known COVID deaths. And known is an important precursor there as of about a year of dealing with this, at least since we've known. That's a lot of people, right? So public health already is elevated in media and politics. Then shortly after the pandemic started, a nationwide study that I just tossed in the chat uh, found a strong relationship between the air pollution around you and your chance of dying from COVID. So we're starting to see the dots get connected very quickly after COVID began. A lot of organizations caught on to this, including our own. And we first tackled this with a report released in June, which I just put in the chat as well, for the state of Washington. And we found that in that state, for every $1 million you invested in green programs that reduce air pollution, you got back $2.4 million in health impact. So the health public health benefit return on investment, ROI, was through the roof from this stuff. And all of this is being elevated in public discourse in the States with COVID. And then all that got even kind of like exponentially grew this month with a new bombshell study that came out earlier in February, which I'm going to put out in the chat right now. And if these links are flying by a little fast, don't worry, we can always follow up with these materials. The new study found that all of these air pollution concerns were 3 times worse than we thought. And now the understanding is that 1 out of 5 deaths globally each year are caused by air pollution. Here in the US, that could be up to or exceeding 350,000 deaths per year. Not that far off from what we've experienced in COVID. That's basically happening every year. And you can look that up by state. Here in Massachusetts, where I'm located, it's about 7,600 deaths per year. And if you apply the statistical value of life to that number, we're talking upwards of $76 billion in public health costs per year from the existing fossil fuel infrastructure that we breathe every day. All of this points to a new paradigm for state climate policy where local challenges are front and center, and public health is one of the big ones. So the most successful environmental campaigns have understood this, and we've observed them to have kept up with the science and to elevated the importance of public health and public health oriented actors in their coalitions and policies. The second big transformation was environmental justice. Now, of course, if you prioritize public health, the science points to another irrefutable truth very quickly, and that's that BIPOC communities have been getting the worst of air pollution for a long, long time. Combine that with the intense spotlight of COVID and the murder of George Floyd, and the civil rights resurgence ended up sending a deep shockwave through the environmental movement, particularly the establishment mainstream wing of the climate movement that has both internally and externally deprioritized environmental justice up to this point. And this isn't just like hearsay, this is tangible actions that occurred. A bombshell letter was leaked about the corporatized racist structure of the Union of Concerned Scientists. The states in the Northeast that work on the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which we'll get into in a sec, had to drastically rethink their approach to equity within the development process of that policy. And they directly cite the resurgence of the civil rights movement and the aggressive and effective action of the environmental justice actors in the region. So the answers that we, and by we, I mean as a large environmental movement made up of a lot of different actors, the answers that we offered to the justice movement a year ago do not cut it anymore. So transformation number 2 is that the most successful environmental campaigns have skated where the puck is going on this, and they put justice to utmost importance in the coalitions that they develop and the policies put forward. That's thing number 2. The last one is reversal in federal leadership. Before I get into the green recovery one, it's a little unique. The reversal in federal leadership. So hopefully this has been a reversal to one of climate leadership, both domestically and internationally. And there's some signs of optimism there. A lot of this is yet to unfold, but we do know from how this goes in the past that the state dynamic is here to stay. And as an organization that works exclusively on state climate policy, I guarantee we spent a long time studying and thinking about whether we'd be needed when or if Biden won the election. Too much of our economy, energy system, and infrastructure is managed by state governments. You see what happens in this past week when with Texas, how important it is for a state government to step up in these arenas. However, we always have to follow the money of the movement here, and there is a problem. What do foundations do when federal government goes Democrat? Foundations on climate. They pull grants from state campaigns and they throw that money into DC. The same thing happened when Obama got elected, which is incredibly risky. And we've observed the same exact thing happening in our states that we follow this time around. And that is incredibly risky because what if Biden does not deliver? And even if he does, what happens if there's not sufficient funding into state campaigns to follow through with the state governments who will be implementing that ambition at the end of the day, regardless? So the state dynamic is just as if not more important than it was under Biden, yet there's less foundation money going into it. So, and I end all of these points with the same exact sentence with different words. The most successful environmental campaigns understand this and are starting to craft very, very strategic uses of revenue that focus on unifying. No longer can one actor have sufficient capital to pass a major policy on climate. It requires the joint capital and resources of many organizations. And that was true before foundation money got pulled from the states. So the last two, which I'll say together, are green recovery and looking ahead to 2030. What does this mean for the future of state policy? And the green recovery one is so important that I'm actually going to go to another slide on that, if you don't mind, Noah. And it's important to acknowledge that with recessions, the common understanding is that climate policy gets delayed because discussions on the future give way to the priorities of the present. Because of some of the examples I've given prior, the public health concern, the science behind that relationship, the importance and potency of green jobs, that no longer is that now is the false dichotomy. Dealing with climate now is synonymous and essential to dealing with COVID and the recession. And again, the most successful campaigns understand this. And we know this based off of how the last recession went, what we need to be preparing right now. So what happened in 2009? And I'll go through this quick because I want to get to the state updates, but this is really, really important. So the last stimulus investment by Obama was and continues to stand to this day so far as the largest green investment in US history, topping $200 billion when combining federal, state, and private spending. And what did we learn from that experience? We saw that when this money was put into action, green programs created a lot of jobs. Green stimulus from this time created nearly 1 million job years, and the clean energy industry has been growing in employment 70% faster than the overall economy ever since. But we made mistakes. Experts suggest that the recovery was slowed because stimulus wasn't big enough, and we invested more money into fossil fuel infrastructure than we did into clean energy. The federal government plays a big role in these shortcomings, but states also messed up. Across the US, the state governments only spent about 2% of flexible transportation funds, for example, on public transit, and most of it went to roads, despite the fact that public transportation investments created 70% more jobs per dollar than a road investment did. Why did that happen? Because stimulus money is meant to get America back on its feet fast, so it largely favors shovel-ready projects. It's much simpler to plan a new road than it is to re-envision a crumbling public transportation system or redesign the streetscape and energy infrastructure that we will need 20 or 30 years from now. But that's exactly what Build Back Better is supposed to be all about. Unlike 2009, we have these additional priorities beyond jobs. There's the added layers of public health and the resiliency of the healthcare system. We know that pollution comes out of the same vents and tailpipes as greenhouse gases and does so worse and worse with every study. And the climate crisis is in a very different spot as well. We're 10 years away from 2030 and we're 30 years away from 2050. So what we build today will be around in that zero emissions future, and it will make or break whether we can avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Iterating all of these plans at the state level amidst this pandemic is extremely challenging. But most literature out there right now is focused on the federal or global level, despite the real implementation of green recovery happening at the state and local level. So whether it's federal stimulus or incoming new state funds, the green recovery moment is coming, and state campaigns need to prepare for that. And so a big change for carbon pricing is, what is the role of carbon pricing, not only as a mitigation strategy, but as a revenue raiser for these other priorities in the state. Now, on to 2030. About half of states have some kind of aspiration or law in place for a 2030 decarbonization target across the US. How many of those states have a sufficiently detailed, ambitious, and equitable plan to achieve that target? It's zero. Zero of them do. You can argue one if you count California, but they do have some long-term problems with their cap and trade program and transportation sector. And they've said loud and clear they will not deal with those until 2022. So the big question of the state level movement for whatever policy you're working on, be it carbon pricing or otherwise, is what is the plan? What is the symphony of policies to achieve a 45 to 50% reduction by 2030? And if you don't have it, when is it going to be ready? And how can we solidify that plan inclusively and equitably with everybody? Campaigns that unify the movement around this central question, that center the priorities of public health, environmental justice, and green recovery within those plans themselves, stand to have the most success in the coming sessions. I'll end my rant there. I apologize, I went a little long, but now we can get into the state updates, which we promised to you. And I'll start with the regional programs. The first one is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. But I do want everyone to keep in mind that those principles with these updates, we want these to be applied to where things are going. And with Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative and the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which I'll get into next, they are all subject to these same questions. What the big question of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative right now is, what role will this program play in the participating states' 2030 goals from now till then? Right now, that's a very unclear and admittedly complicated question to answer. But there's something really important that happened with RGGI this past year that flew under the radar. And that's back when lockdown began. Now, lockdown was a really important test for carbon markets because it delivered a shock to the system. And it's pretty easy to understand why. Less economic activity equals less pollution, which equals less demand for the allowances that these programs offer, which leads to a collapsed auction and collapsed revenues for the involved states. And this is exactly what happened in California. It was one of the worst collapses in the history of the program, and a really volatile moment for everyone involved. Back in April, I jumped on a webinar with the consultants who do the projections for polluters, right? The ones who buy these allowances, the market, who's telling the market how these things are going to go. And those consultants said something really peculiar, and that they projected the California market to collapse, but not RGGI. RGGI was expected to stay stable as ever. Why was that? Is because the market, aka the polluters, have a very different and more honest political understanding of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They know that the conversation on RGGI and what it is about and what it isn't supposed to do is actually addressed fairly openly every program review. So they know that whatever collapse in demand the COVID lockdown would create in that system, the state governments are assumed to correct for it in the next program review in 2021. Hence, it is safe to continue to invest in those allowances and buy them. Why is this important? Because it means that the concept of a regional market is further battle tested. More honest and transparent systems like RGGI survived way better than more centrally and dictatorially, admittedly, controlled systems like California's. Now, in terms of what the future holds, 2021 is the year that the program review starts. And this is when states will determine how much to slash down the future supply of allowances, the cap trajectory, the ambition of the program. And this is just as much a collective exercise in determining what reductions to achieve in the power sector overall as it is a simple negotiation over the numbers of RGGI itself. Onto the Transportation and Climate Initiative. This has been sucking up a lot of political capital in the Northeast, and I'm sure those of you working on other initiatives in the states have felt that. And that is basically RGGI for cars, right? That program has gone through a lot of volatile changes, including with the environmental justice community in terms of how they're talking about and baking equity in the program. However, it has proceeded relatively on schedule. Right now, we have 3 signatory states. That is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, as well as the jurisdiction of Washington, D.C., are all committed to starting the program together in 2023. The other states are still part of TCI, but have not decided whether they will start with them in 2023. And that was as expected for those following from the beginning. And a lot of that has to do with the timing of elections and the amount of time between now and the start of the program that they still have to sign on. So they're not feeling particularly rushed. So expect more states to join in. But right now, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have their hands on the wheel. Same question as RGGI here. It's not necessarily about TCI being the policy, because we all know that pricing is really, really hard to get passed in an ambitious way. So TCI is really predominantly a revenue raiser first and an environmental mitigation tool second, and albeit still a useful tool. And so every state actor I implore you to go through the same process of every other policy when it comes to TCI in the state. And that is to press your policymakers on what role TCI is going to play in reducing transportation emissions between now and 2030, and have them show the difference of what is left through other policies and show that on paper with modeling and numbers. That's going to be the big exercise that all these states are going through with RGGI TCI and their 2030 plans. I'll stop there, other than to mention that there is a update on the TCI program coming up on March 1st. I don't have the link pulled up, but I'll throw it in the chat while Noah takes on some of the state updates. But then for there, I'll end on the regional ones, and happy to take questions either now or I guess at the end probably would be more useful.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonah. And I'm just going to rapid fire kind of go through these state updates, most of which have been gathered by you all on the ground that are doing some of this lobbying and coalition building work. So definitely, like I said earlier, feel free to add additional information in the chat box or reach out to me and we can update some of our information that we're sharing with people on the ground. But we're going to look at the New England states today, starting with Rhode Island. And also this, I'm definitely happy to share the slide deck with anybody who is interested. So don't worry about having to get all this information down. Purposely made it text heavy for that reason. The governor has been committed to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Big focus on offshore wind there. And as Jonah mentioned, Rhode Island is one of the states that is set to be a part of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Big focus this session is on the Act on Climate 2020 bill, which the main goal there is to make emission reductions much more aggressive and mandatory. So previous iterations of emission targets didn't really have teeth comparatively to this one. This is aiming for net zero by 2050, and that's going to be a big lobbying focus for the Rhode Island climate community. And most reports from my conversations with advocates on the ground that the carbon pricing bill has been reintroduced, but it's not a major focus of the environmental community this session. One of the things that since I started working at ClimateXChange more than 2 years ago, highly anticipated carbon pricing study was released a couple weeks back, hasn't gained much media coverage. Findings, I would say, are pretty much in line with most results of carbon pricing studies that have come out in the last couple of years. So the price points that were analyzed in the study, unsurprisingly found that they alone would not reach emission reduction targets. And that's kind of in line with what our mindset has been about carbon pricing, is that it's not a silver bullet solution and that it really needs to work hand in hand with additional policies to collectively help reduce emissions to the point necessary. Two things that the study found were important, both in the process and in the actual policy design, was how revenue was going to be utilized and equity provisions. So that's something that, obviously very central to carbon pricing conversations really in all states, also a focus of this study that was released. And then I think also not surprisingly, but important to note, that the aggregate economic impacts are expected to be negligible. And that's what we tend to find when these types of reports. And then finally, that a wider geographic scope would lead to greater success. Also something that we can expect, states working collectively, and that's part of our theory of change as an organization, is to encourage states to work collectively and cross collaborate on these policies and initiatives. Moving along to New Hampshire, again, another state where Democrats do hold the majority, or although I'm not sure if this has switched. I think this slide actually might be out of date, but I know on the governor front, Governor Sununu has been one of the most anti-climate action governors in New England, has been pretty vocally against TCI. And while the state is a part of RGGI, even that kind of was a more reluctant move than I would say most of the New England states have been pretty enthusiastic about that program. Most proceeds are returned to taxpayers. This session, the big focus is on an act establishing greenhouse gas emission reduction goals for the state and establishing a climate action plan. That's been introduced in both chambers. It establishes a 20% reduction goal by 2025, 50% by 2035, and then net zero by 2050. And also calls for the Department of Environmental Services to develop a climate plan by July of 2023. And that plan very much in line with what other New England states have already undergone, so a little bit behind in the process there, but we'll develop a plan that will consider market-based mechanisms, will consider how important it is to invest in vulnerable communities, rural communities, low-income communities, and finally recommend how the state can provide job retraining and ensure a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy economy. Moving to Connecticut, Governor Lamont has also been pretty vocal on prioritizing climate issues. The goal there is 100% renewable by 2040. Governor Lamont also proposed a mileage-based fee on tractor trailers that is estimated to raise $90 million annually. No major carbon pricing bill introduced this session, but like Rhode Island, the state is on track to join TCI right now and is a part of RGGI. And then there was this report that, Jonah, if you want to share in the chat box, the Progress and Mitigation Strategies Working Group released a final report issuing priorities on achieving synergies among actions that both cut pollution and then also prepare for the impacts of climate change. Definitely we're seeing that common thread between aligning mitigation and adaptation measures across the New England states, ensuring that regulatory programs and state decision-making as a whole takes into account the impact on greenhouse gas reduction goals. And then also that, kind of like what Jonah mentioned previously, that these programs are accounting for the health and social cost impacts. And we've definitely seen with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, increased focus on public health as a policy tool here. Moving along to Maine, the first time that Maine introduced carbon pricing in the last couple of years was in 2019. And that was a bill that didn't gain much traction from the broader climate community. In June of 2019, kind of the main measures that passed were 100% renewable by 2050, additional solar incentives, and then an act to establish the Maine Climate Council. So we're seeing these councils kind of pop up. Some states are already kind of in the process of coming out with those recommendations, while others like New Hampshire are pushing to have these kind of councils and working groups come together in the first place. And definitely, with the urgency of the climate crisis today, it is really critical that these states take that first step, that really preliminary first step to gather key stakeholders. So we've seen Maine undergo that process and release its 4-year plan for climate action, which I've summarized kind of some of the key points here, but definitely worth taking a look at and kind of further analyzing these different climate plans, which I can definitely follow up links if they're not already in the chat box to all of these. But Maine's climate plan establishes emission reduction targets and really kind of categorizes 4 main sections on the future of transportation, modernizing Maine's buildings, reducing carbon emissions in the energy and industrial sectors, and then finally growing the clean energy economy and protecting natural resources. So pretty similar to a lot of these other states, but this plan has already come out, and we've been kind of in touch with a lot of the climate advocates in Maine that are part of that working group and commission, and hope to kind of receive additional updates as those progress. Finally, to Vermont, Again, another state where there is a Democratic majority, which we tend to align with, greater potential for climate action, although certainly we don't want to oversimplify and suggest that, a Democratic majority means that, passing ambitious policy will be easy. That's definitely has not been the case. But there was a big success last year with the passage of the Global Warming Solutions Act, really cemented strong emission reduction goals and created the Vermont Climate Council, which is set to come up with a pollution reduction plan by the end of 2021. And we saw that act be vetoed by the governor, and that was ultimately overridden. And that definitely, in 2020, this was one of the big successes for climate action in the region. We were excited to hear from our partners and friends at Energy Independent Vermont and others kind of sharing the success of that initiative. And as we mentioned previously, Vermont, like the other states, is a member of RGGI, but is not currently on track to join the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Another act that we've been kind of following is the Transportation and Modernization Act, which Jonah can share a link to additional information about that in the chat box as well. But ultimately, this is one that makes it easier for low to moderate income Vermonters to purchase low and zero emission vehicles. And also there's the public safety measures, there's also the pollution reduction targets that will come with that. So looking at public transit, looking at improving corridors for cyclists and pedestrians, that's one that we're kind of anticipating to continue following this upcoming session. And then Massachusetts, I'll pass it back to you, Jonah, since Jonah's been very involved in the state's efforts.
Yeah, sure. I'm calling in from Somerville, by the way, if anyone else is in Massachusetts. So I'm always curious to hear where people are calling in from. But Massachusetts has been a flurry over the past few months because of a delayed effort of conference committee bills getting written, submitted to the governor, vetoed or passed back with amendments, reconsidered, getting passed back. And a lot of that is on these questions we highlighted in the beginning. What is the goal for 2050? There's been a spat between the governor and the legislature on whether it should be 45% or 50%. Environmental justice is making a huge surge in the priority of the governor and the legislature. And the big question for this coming session is then what is the bill? Like, what is the framework for addressing these environmental justice concerns in a more deep, meaningful way? And then there's TCI. Massachusetts has had to really pull states along on that program because of how difficult it is to get this many states to agree to something like this when you have a lot of opposition from fiscal conservative oriented oppositions groups in the state or industries. And so the governor's been putting a lot of political capital into TCI, and that is expected to resolve over the next month or so, where the conference committee bill is getting sent back to the governor. He likely will have to accept some things he doesn't like, which may include a 50% target rather than 45 for 2030. And that means that his clean energy and climate plan, this is the 2030 plans we're talking about, which was drafted and shared with the public a couple months ago for 45%, likely will need to get revised. But there's a lot of work going into these exact questions of what roles to play what in the state. The big thing that is on legislatures' minds next is resources. What resources can we unlock to enable the governor to achieve these targets, which is where carbon pricing may or may not play a role. There's a bill released in the House and Senate on carbon pricing. They have very similar strokes, but are different in some big ways, as well as a whole host of other regulatory bills that are usually see there, such as 100% renewables. Air pollution monitoring is a big concern and something that needs funding in the state as well. So the ecosystem of bills is still unfolding, but it's all pointing towards the next big question being raising new resources for a fiscally limited state apparatus, which is, I think, a very common problem that you may feel in your state as well.
Awesome, thanks, Jonah. And then just the last state here, New York. So obviously last session, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed, which ultimately became one of the nation's most aggressive climate laws, requiring net zero by 2050, and then 40% of the state's climate and energy funding to be invested in environmental justice communities. So that's been one of the bills that we've kind of followed last year. This year, kind of the partner bill to that, the Climate and Community Investment Act, is one that we've seen New York Renews pushing for, establishing a polluter fee that is expected to generate significant revenue that can help actually pay for some of these programs and emission reduction goals. So there's a good fact sheet I think on that website. And then I think, Jonah, if you can also hyperlink a good chart that I got this afternoon from Lynn Meyer, tracking additional climate legislation in New York, that I think that will be helpful for people to review. But I know we're just about running out of time, so I want to just wrap up and share that if you would like to hear these updates from actually the advocates on the ground who are making these, working on these efforts and actually pushing for these different bills, I encourage you all to sign up for our national SCPN calls. I know many of you have been engaged with those. We have one on this upcoming Wednesday. They're on the last Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And that's just an opportunity to hear from lawmakers and advocates as they're lobbying for different bills. We usually have a selection of states from across the country. But that's it for me today. Definitely feel free to submit questions in the chat box. And we are happy to take them. I think we have a couple more minutes before we have to wrap up. And additionally, if people don't have any additional questions, feel free to also share updates if you're in one of these states and wanted to supplement something that Jonah and I mentioned.
Yeah, let us know those doing the technicals behind the scenes, what you'd like to do to proceed. But I do see some questions. I'm happy to just go with them is for the purpose of wrapping this up.
Go for it, Jonah.
Yeah, the first one from Walter is what mechanisms are supposed to achieve these ambitious targets? Amazing question. I think the obligation of carbon pricing advocates is to understand the wealth of other policies required so that they can then propose a smart role for carbon pricing to play within those solutions. And you have to take that sector by sector. You're seeing a lot of states, the way they do these climate plans is they break them down into wedges. What are the 3 or 4 main things that we got to do in electricity for 2030 and for 2050? And the same kind of exercise for transportation. I think the details of those mechanisms that I go beyond this call, and definitely something that we would like to provide toolkits in the future to advocates to deeper understand those problems. But the main thing I would say is break it down by wedge, separate out into finance mechanisms, incentives, rebates, regulatory requirements for actors, and then system level requirements. And it typically falls into one of those buckets. I'm going to jump straight into the second question I see that's really important about air pollution. And that's from David about quoting that 76 billion costs in health due to climate related health issues or carbon pollution. This is actually, I'll be very, very precise, explicitly from the particulate matter that comes out of the same places as greenhouse gases. It does not include, and it's only death. Think of all the child asthma. Think of all the non-mortality related emergency health or emergency room visits that happen in your state. So it's 76 billion is a very limited figure of just the people who die from breathing in particulate matter in your state every year. For Massachusetts, it's 76 billion. So that number is extremely low. If you account for all the damages, including the social cost of carbon, then we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars of social damage from 1 metric ton of CO2 if you include those other pollution measures. The science is here and the politics are here on what the real numbers are telling us about the damage that you as a state pay. You do not need the morality of the climate crisis to do this stuff. If it didn't exist, this would still be a no-brainer to address these problems in the state. It's 4:08. Do we have time for one more? One more. Okay. I see. Let's see. Do you have a preference on tax versus cap and trade? From Roger. The answer is no. We are policy agnostic. It's about how they're designed. You can have an incredible carbon tax design, and you can have a god-awful carbon tax design. Now, we do understand politics. So we understand that one of those is passed in the US and the other hasn't. And there's very clear reasons why. And I just dealt with this week in Maryland. If you put forward a carbon tax, what committee is that most likely to go to in the state? It's likely to go to a more conservative oriented fiscal committee. If you put forward a cap and trade program, that often gets considered an environmental regulation, and it tends to go towards environmentally oriented committees. And so there's a lot of hurdles in the way for a carbon tax to be designed effectively. And a lot of those hurdles exist for cap and trade as well in different flavors that lead it to be really hard to do a cap and trade program that's actually very ambitious. But in terms of in theory, no, we do not consider one to be better than the other. It's going to be a hybrid regardless, to be honest. It's 4:10. Should we do some more, or are we all set here? Okay. All set. No more questions, Your Honor, but our contact info is there. Please reach out with questions. Please join the network because it's a service model for all of these questions to be answered. We're here to support these campaigns. So if you want to discuss more, please come to that network because that is the only way we can further help you guys is if you're part of the network. So please join.